Hi everyone, Pastor Jimmy at Mount Pleasant Baptist Church, continuing our study on the characteristics and attributes of God in the book of Genesis. Today we're going to look at Genesis chapter 10. Now, this is one of those chapters, before I ask you to pick up your Bible and read, that most people would skip over. You begin reading Genesis chapter 10 and you see all the genealogies and you see all the people that were from this line and from this person and this person and this nation and that nation. And you just like, I don't need to read this. This isn't important. But today I want us to look at some of the attributes that we can see and characteristics of God and some things we can learn from Genesis chapter 10. So as we go through Genesis chapter 10, before we get into it, I want you to pause the video, go get your Bible, read through the whole chapter of Genesis chapter 10, read through it, and then we'll come back and we'll see God's characteristics and attributes. Okay, now that you've had a chance to read Genesis chapter 10, you're coming back and you're wondering, well, what can we learn from this? All I learned from this was a bunch of names that I couldn't pronounce, a few nations that maybe I recognized, but what can I learn from this? Well, right off the bat, verse 1. This is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. And you're like, yeah, but what does that show me? Shows us that God is a God of mercy and a God that loves us. Well, why? Well, go down to verse 32. First verse in the chapter, last verse in the chapter. Read what verse 32 says. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent within their nations. From these, the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. The thing I want us to look here is both of these verses talk about what happened after the flood. You see, we see how God's mercy worked after the flood. We're reminded that God had destroyed the entire earth, that there was a flood and that all the earth had been destroyed. We're reminded of that. And we're reminded throughout this whole chapter that God blessed Noah and his sons. He was merciful to them. And He promised them that He would help them. And He did, because of all these nations and all the people that came from them. So one of the first things we can learn here in this chapter is that God is a merciful God. God is a promise keeper. And God is a God of blessings, as we've seen before. The second thing that we can learn in this chapter is that God is resolute. As you look throughout this chapter, you see what many people call the table of nations that came from the sons of Noah. And we're also reminded, though, of all the evil that comes from Noah's family. I know that Noah and his family were the only ones saved, but sin still reigned upon the earth even after the ark. We see that very quickly in the life of Noah. But we also see here that God is resolute. What do I mean by that? I mean that He made a promise that He wasn't going to destroy the earth by flood again, that He was going to let mankind and Noah's family live. And as they continue to live, as they continue to grow, as the nations continue to grow, they continue to sin. And we see a lot of these nations mentioned here. We're going to see them continue to sin against God throughout the Bible. And even through all that, God is resolute. We see Him not bringing down punishment upon man. But instead, what we see is we see God bringing redemption. First of all, we see God bringing redemption through the Israelite people as He shows them how He loves them, and He shows them how to sacrifice, and He sets up laws and rules for them to be forgiven and their sins to be covered. And then as you progress into the New Testament, we see God bring redemption through Jesus Christ. And we see a God that is resolute in bringing redemption instead of destruction upon man. And so as we look at this chapter and we go, well, what can we learn from all these genealogies? We can learn that God is a merciful God that took care of His people after the flood. We can learn that God is a God of blessing that continued to bless mankind after the flood. But maybe most importantly, as we see that God is a resolute God that continued to hold firm to His promises, even though mankind turned back to sin, even though mankind still continued to turn their back on God, God is a God that was resolute. He didn't destroy the earth once again. Instead, God began to plan and bring redemption to all of mankind through Jesus Christ.